Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review, and I'm sorry but I'm here to talk about dongles again. And on this occasion in particular, I happen to end up with 3 different Shanling dongles here, so I thought it'd be interesting for those of you that like Shanling, maybe you've been looking at one of these models, I thought it might be interesting to tell you how they stack up against one another, and I'll throw in obviously a comparison from outside this mix to give you a sense of how they compare as well. I want to quickly introduce each of the dongles and tell you who supplied them to me. As is always the case, even though these have been sent to me by various retailers, they have no influence over what I'm going to tell you, so I'm going to tell you the good, the bad and the ugly as always. Starting off, we've got the UA2, that was sent to me by Melbourne Tri-Fi Audio, so thank you to them. The UA3 was sent to me by the Geeky Audio Store on AliExpress. And then finally, the UA5 was sent to me by Hi-Fi Go. And that was sent to me quite some time ago because I've already done a full review of the UA5. That was in the second Great Dongle Fondle, 2 Dongle, 2 Fondle. So go check that one out if you're interested. This is going to touch on the UA5. It's not going to be a full review of that one. I'm going to focus much more on the UA2 and the UA3 with comparison to the UA5 for context. So check out the Great Dongle Fondle number 2 if you want to know more about the UA5. But for now, let's jump into talking about the UA2 as the cheapest option in this roundup. The UA2 comes in at $85 US, making it a very affordable dongle, particularly for one that's got balanced output, as we'll talk about shortly. It uses the ES9038Q2M chip and has an impressive decoding capability all the way up to DSD512 and PCM768 if that matters to you. Power output from that aforementioned balanced output is 195 milliwatts into 32 ohms. And in terms of features and specs, the only other thing that I think is worth really talking about with it is the fact that it's got a little mode button on the side, and that mode button is going to allow you to switch it into different USB modes. So there's UAC1, UAC2, which means you can use it with a console if you want to. Some consoles and older devices use a very basic version of the USB protocols, and that's why that mode button is important. So it'll do that if you need it to, but all my testing's been done using a USB connection to my Android phone and playing through USB Audio Player Pro. That means we're bypassing the Android processing and getting maximum possible sound quality. Before I talk specifically about the sound of the UA2, a couple of things to mention is that I found myself using fairly high volume from it, even though I was using just IEMs like the IE900s. These are not difficult to drive IEMs, and yet I was still finding that I was having to push the volume all the way up to about minus 17 dB, keeping in mind that the maximum volume is 0 dB. And so I was pretty close to full volume even on the IE900s, and that wasn't loud listening. Trying a full-size headphone like the Focal Clear MG, and I've got the review of that one coming soon, so make sure you subscribe if you want to see that one. Moving over to the Focal Clear MG, I was up to about minus 9 dB, and then trying something more difficult like the Hi-Fi Aria Stealth, that was almost at maximum volume to get what I'd call normal listening levels. So do be aware that it says it's got 195 milliwatts at 32 ohms, but that doesn't necessarily equate to it punching out huge amounts of volume at different impedances. I don't know exactly what's going on as to why it wasn't giving me those volume levels. This was from the balanced output to get maximum power, and it still seemed like it was not struggling. The sound quality from each thing I tried was good. There was no sense of it distorting or running out of puff, but I didn't feel like it actually had the power on tap that the specifications suggested. Maybe it's an intelligent system that adapts how it delivers the power depending on the actual device connected. I'm not sure. The key point is it will drive anything other than probably something like an Aria Stealth or some of those slightly more difficult planers. And that means that for portable headphones, IEMs, etc., you're going to have no problems at all. Keep in mind that if you are using the single-ended output instead of the balanced output, that's going to halve your power. And so if you do have something that you know is a bit more difficult to drive, do be prepared to plug it into the balanced output to give you every chance to get the most out of it. The sound quality between the single-ended and the balanced output is identical, so you don't need to use balance from a sound quality point of view, just purely from a power delivery point of view. And so with all that said, let's talk about how the UA2 sounds. And I'd say that it sounds kind of full and rich in a good way. It's got a good sense of detail, but it is a smoother, slightly warmer tonality. The staging presentation, so how the sort of sound is placed around the soundstage, I would say is solid or good for a warmer sounding device. So warmer sounding devices will generally not give you the same sense of space and expansiveness in the soundstage. But based on the tonality that it delivers, I think it's doing a good job with the staging as well. As is generally the case with these sorts of devices, depth in the soundstage is quite limited, but not bad at all. I didn't feel like it was one of those wall of sound, only left and right presentations. It did give me some sense of depth, but it's not like it's throwing a huge sense of depth in the soundstage. And so overall, I thought it sounded good, but again, this is out of context, so I wanted to grab another device to see how it really compared. The device I happened to reach for was the Hidizs XO. I've recently reviewed this one. This is a brand new dongle on the market, and I really liked it in the review where I compared it with the Hidizs S9 Pro, and I was also talking about the Eco ITM02. So go check out that one if you want to know more about the XO in terms of details, or the ITM02, or the S9 Pro. But what I wanted to do for now was compare this one, which is going to sit at about the $99 mark, with the slightly cheaper UA2 to see how they compared. Both devices have balanced output, so I used balanced output for all my testing. One of the tracks that I listened to for this test was Fou by L'Impératrice, and I felt like the XO was coming across a little bit more neutral in the mids. It wasn't quite as thick sounding through the mid-range as the UA2 does. I also felt like the XO was giving me a slightly greater sense of control over the bass and also punch. So it wasn't like it was pulling back on the amount of bass, it was just controlling it better, and the result was a tighter, thumpier sound. The UA2 is a little bit smoother, so for those of you that might have a slightly aggressive pair of headphones or earphones and you're looking for something just to kind of tame them a tiny bit, the UA2 could be great for that. And that's not me suggesting that it's actually a warm and kind of soggy sound. It's actually a very good quality sound, but it does lean towards that slightly warmer, slightly smoother and more forgiving sound. And I really enjoy the UA2. It's going to come down in many cases, I think, to the synergy. If you've got a more neutral sounding IEM and you want to maintain that, then you go for the XO. But if maybe you've got that same more neutral IEM and you want it to be a little bit warmer sounding overall, then the UA2 would actually be better. So both of these are very good dongles, they've just got slightly different sounds. One area that I do think the XO maybe steps forward a little bit, and this could be partly due to the tuning, but also could be due to its technical prowess, is I feel like the XO was just bringing out a little bit more detail and texture in the sound. It comes across sounding like the slightly more resolving dongle. And so ultimately for me, if I was choosing between the two, I don't think there's anything wrong with choosing the UA2, but if you've got just a little bit more money to spend, and actually as I think about this, I think at the time I'm recording this, I still don't know the actual price that the XO is going to land at, but for that round about $100 mark, if you can get up just a little bit higher potentially than the UA2, I think the XO could be the better choice. But that's not to say that the UA2 is bad, I think it's a really nice dongle. The other thing worth keeping in mind potentially though, is that for just a little bit more money, you can step up to the UA3. The UA3 brings us a different DAC chip. In this case, it's using the AK4493SEQ, but just like the UA2, it's giving you DSD512 and PCM768 capability, and it's also giving us a bit more power. So the UA3 will give us 211 milliwatts into 32 ohms, so that's up from 195 in the UA2. And I did find that it made a significant difference driving the Focal MGs and also the ARIA Stealths. So with the ARIA Stealth, I was getting to about minus 10 dB, so still stretching the device, but not quite to the same degree. And the Focal Clear MG was at a pretty comfortable minus 15 dB. So there was still a good amount of headroom there. I didn't feel like the device was ever straining on either the Focals or the ARIA. And so if you do want that bit more power, that's where the UA3 could be a good choice, assuming you like what I'm about to say about the sound. Before I do talk about the sound, a couple of other things that I want to talk about. The UA3 here has some other buttons on the device. It doesn't have the same mode button that the UA2 does. Instead, it's got some controls. So you've got a forwards, a backwards, and a pause play control. I'm not necessarily a huge fan of controls on dongles. I don't really care for it either way. I don't dislike it, I've got no issue with it, but it's not a selling point for me. It might be for you. But while we're talking about physical design, the other thing that I really like about the UA3 is it's using a 4.4mm connector instead of the 2.5mm on the UA2 and also on the XO from Hidizs. As always, I did a quick check between the balanced and the single-ended connector, and I do feel like in the UA3, the single-ended output is not quite as comparable to the balanced as it was on the UA2. So with the UA2, other than power, I think sonically, the balanced and single-ended are directly comparable. I think you could flick between the two and the differences are negligible. I felt like though with the UA3, there was a little bit more difference. The single-ended wasn't bad by any stretch, but it did come across sounding just a little bit thicker potentially. And so for some people, they're not going to enjoy that as much. For other people, you might even prefer that. But for me, it's not one of those cases where I'd say use whichever output you like. They're both the same. There is a little bit of a difference. And so keep that in mind. All of my main testing is being done with a balanced output from these, and I would recommend using balanced when you can from these for the extra power and also the maximum sound quality in the case of the UA3. And so with that in mind, let's talk about what I was hearing. And first and foremost, going from the UA2 to the UA3, I felt like the soundstage got a bit bigger and the separation of individual sounds was stronger as well. I think the UA3 is also slightly more neutral and a bit more articulate sounding, so you can hear kind of the leading edges of notes have a bit more clarity, a bit more attack, and for me it was the better overall sound. Knowing that I do think it's an immediate upgrade from the UA2, I was then curious to see how it compared to the Hidizs XO again. So remember, the Hidizs XO for me was just a little bit better than the UA2. I felt like it gave me better resolution and detail, and a slightly more neutral sound, assuming that's better, which it isn't always. But I was curious to see then how the UA3 compared to the XO, if it was able to jump above the XO in terms of performance. Listening to What's That You Say by Joan Osborne, I do think that the UA3 does pull ahead just a little bit. The UA3 sounded just a little bit brighter than the XO, and in that sense, it probably brings out a little bit more detail and texture and resolution than the Hidizs XO. I feel like the UA3 is a bit more forward, a bit more dynamic, a bit more energetic, whereas the XO was a bit more relaxed to listen to, and that could be a good thing for some people, but I think the UA3 is just a little bit more technically capable. Knowing that the UA3 has the 4.4mm output, which I really like, and the fact that I very, very slightly prefer its sound, even though the XO is excellent, I think for me, in looking at them so far, they're all performing pretty much to price. The UA2 is really strong at its $85 price tag. The XO sits just a little bit higher for me in terms of performance, regardless of its price tag. And then stepping up again to over the $100 mark, which I believe the XO is going to sit clearly under, stepping up again to $110, the UA3 definitely, for me at least, justifies its price. And so that got me wondering just how much of a jump it would then be to go to the much more expensive UA5. This is a bigger device. It's got a built-in internal battery to help isolate the audio circuits from the USB power. I've talked about that at length in the other review, so go check that one out. But as I looked at the specs, there was something really interesting about the UA5, and that is that it uses the same DAC chip as the UA2, but it uses two of them instead of one. And it uses the exact same output stage, being a pair of Rycore op amps. It uses that the same as the UA3. So it's almost like a hybrid, an improved hybrid if you like, of the UA2 and the UA3 put together. And that had me really curious as to what I was going to hear when I compared it to the UA3. Before I get to the comparison, the other things to mention are that it once again does DSD 512 and PCM 768. And just like the UA3, it's capable of putting out 211 milliwatts into a 32 ohm load. And so I fired up St. Paul by Corey Wong. This is a live recording in Amsterdam. It's not a great recording, but it happened to come around. I was enjoying listening to it, and so I compared the UA5 and the UA3 with that one. And it was a really interesting comparison. Both did sound great, but the UA3 came across as a bit thicker and a bit less resolving. And so there's a common theme here. As you go up in price here, you're getting more resolution, more detail, more texture. That also resulted in a better sense of articulation from the UA5, so the sense of attack on leading edges was a bit cleaner, a bit crisper, and it all helped on this recording, which I said wasn't a great one, to bring the music a bit more to life from the UA5. The UA5, because of its interface, also gives you some filter choices, so that gives you more versatility. Most of my testing here was done with the fast linear filter, and as I listen more and more, what I'd say is that I definitely think there's a reason to spend more than the UA3 and to get the UA5 if you've got the budget and you're interested in the upgrades. But it's also not to say that the UA3 is bad. And indeed, this whole process has shown me that Shanling continued to turn out some fantastic products. I think their dongles, whether it's the UP4, the UA2, the UA3, the UA5, I think all of their dongles are really, really solid. The Shanling house sound, if you like, tends to lean towards a slightly smoother, slightly richer sound, and I think that's a good thing. So even with the UA5, it was more resolving and textured than the others, but it never got lean or aggressive or harsh. And I really like that about the Shanling units. All of them have a sense of musicality about them, and I know that term doesn't really mean much, but my point is they don't go into the realm of overly sterile, overly clinical sound, but they still manage to extract detail and texture and clarity. And so really what's happening here is as you go from the UA2 to the UA3 to the UA5, what you're getting is an increase each time in the amount of detail retrieval and clarity and resolution, but still an overall similar tonality, which I think is a wonderful one. Now, no doubt, a product like the Hidizs XO does sit nicely in between the UA2 and the UA3 as a better option in my opinion, And so there'll always be other bits and pieces that slot in around these that are good choices. And I've tried to cover those elsewhere in things like the Dongle Fondle 2, all of those sorts of fun videos. I've tried to give you a good sense of what's out there, but the Shanlings are definitely worth considering in my opinion. In case you're wondering, I still think my favourite dongle so far, in terms of what I'd call a traditional dongle that's not a powered dongle with a standalone battery. Obviously there is a battery in the UA5, but it doesn't require charging separately necessarily. So in the case of the normal kind of dongles that you just plug in and go straight away, I think the Quest-style M15 is probably still my absolute favourite, but the UA5 sits right behind it still. And so that probably gives you a sense of just how good I think the Shanlings are. And knowing that the UA3 comes close to the UA5 and the UA2 comes close to the UA3, that should give you a sense of the fact that I think these are great. So once again, I want to say thanks to the retailers that sent me these. I hope I've been able to paint a bit of a picture for you as to how the Shanling dongles are performing. And if you have found this review useful or interesting, I'd love it if you'd hit the like button and consider subscribing and ring the notification bell if you haven't already. But for now, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.